Ever had to stand up to someone everyone else feared?
It always starts with a toast, doesn't it? That smug little clink of glasses, the fake laughter, the over-rehearsed speech that everyone pretends is spontaneous, the obligatory, "we're so proud," followed by a soft piano track from someone's portable speaker, and the knowing glances around the family table that all say the same unspoken thing: he's the one who made it. We were gathered at my parents' lake house, same as every 4th of July, with red and blue paper lanterns dangling from the patio beams and kids running barefoot across the lawn, covered in sticky watermelon juice and sunscreen. It was one of those picture-perfect suburban holidays you'd expect to see on a Hallmark card, except I wasn't in the mood to smile. My brother, Derek, stood at the center of the deck like he was hosting a damn TED Talk. He wore one of those crisp linen button-ups that probably cost more than my car's down payment, his teeth gleaming like he'd just come from a photo shoot. His wife, Marissa, always camera-ready and Botox-polished, held his arm like a purse she was proud to carry. Dad raised his glass high, and with a voice that still echoed authority even at 72, he said, "Let's raise a glass to my son, Derek Hastings, for building a legacy we can all be proud of." The crowd, mostly extended family, Derek's college buddies, a couple of investment partners whose names I didn't care to remember, broke into applause. Some even stood up. Mom dabbed her eyes like this was a goddamn graduation, not a barbecue. And me? I sat there with a paper plate of half-eaten ribs and warm coleslaw, quietly folding my napkin into a triangle like it mattered. No one mentioned me. No one ever did. Not when I helped build the software that Derek used to launch his company. Not when I was the one working 14-hour days coding through postpartum depression while Derek was off networking with venture capitalists in Napa. Not when I got pushed out during what they called a strategic restructure after my husband left me and I had to take time off. I wasn't even erased. I was never written in. I stood up without a word. No dramatic exit, no wine glass slam, no eye roll. Just stood up, walked past the grill and the cooler, past the toddler chasing bubbles, past Derek mid-toast, and picked up the kitchen trash bag. It was full, overflowing with empty beer bottles, paper towels stained in barbecue sauce, and the paper name tags my mom insists on printing for guests as if anyone cares. I tied the bag and hauled it to the dumpster out back. My sandals stuck in the mud and a mosquito bit my wrist, but I felt lighter. I paused before going back inside and pulled out my phone. Midnight was scheduled. The release had been triple-checked. Legal had greenlit it, the journalist had confirmed the quotes, and my name was on it. By the time the morning sun hit Derek's beloved Audi, parked like a trophy at the front of the driveway, the world would finally see who really built the legacy. Let me back up a second. You might think I'm bitter. That this is jealousy talking. That I'm some washed-up older sister who can't handle her younger brother's success. But here's the thing, I was the co-founder. I filed the LLC paperwork. I named the damn product. I wrote the first 2,000 lines of code that still sit untouched in the core of his shiny AI-driven fraud detection platform. When I got pregnant, he smiled and told me to take the time I needed. And while I was home crying into a breast pump and trying to find childcare, he got a lawyer to quietly transfer voting rights. By the time I came back, my title was consultant, and my email didn't work. Mom told me not to make a scene. Dad said, be proud of him. That's what family does. So I swallowed it. Year after year. I came to the birthdays, brought the potato salad, showed up with presents for their kids, wrote cards signed, with love, and Claire. I didn't raise hell. I didn't sue. I didn't even speak. Until now. Back on the deck, they were lighting sparklers and playing Bruce Springsteen from a portable speaker. Derek stood surrounded by people laughing too loudly at his jokes, and I watched him like I was watching a movie I'd already seen and hated. When he caught my eye, he smiled that perfect "you doing okay, sis" smile, the one that meant nothing and everything at once. I smiled back and lifted my glass of lemonade. He had no idea. That's what made it beautiful. The irony was delicious. The woman who'd written the backbone of his empire, cast aside like day-old bread, was about to press send on a truth bomb that would wipe the shine off his legacy like ketchup on a white shirt. The document was ready. 12 pages. Detailed, dated, and full of screenshots. The email had been drafted weeks ago, but I waited for this day, our family's most performative, flag-waving holiday, because Derek loved symbolism. He always did. It would mean something to him when he saw the timestamp. 12:01 a.m., July 5th. The day after the fireworks. The day after the toast. The moment after everyone believed the lie for the very last time. I put my phone back in my pocket and walked to the back of the house. From the kitchen window, I could hear Marissa telling someone about her new Pilates instructor and Derek talking business with Uncle Kevin. Nobody missed me. Nobody ever did. But tomorrow? They'd all remember my name. And when the world starts asking questions Derek can't answer, when reporters dig into old patents and find my name on the original design, when investors start pulling out and publicists start spiraling, I'll be exactly where I want to be. Nowhere near him. I won't give a press conference. I won't gloat. I won't say a damn word. I'll just sit back, sip my coffee, and watch the headlines do what I never could: tell the truth. So when people ask what finally made me snap, I won't say rage or revenge or even justice. I'll say this: I just got tired of taking out everyone else's trash. Some people vanish in a car crash or a house fire or a bad relationship. I disappeared in silence, in long meetings where I wasn't spoken to, in group emails where my name was removed from the to field, in boardrooms where men in slim-fit suits used phrases I had written years earlier as if they had invented them that morning. You don't need to be fired to be erased. Sometimes, they just stop looking at you like you're part of it. And after a while, you start to believe it. Before Derek became the founder, he was just my annoying little brother who couldn't install a printer without calling me. In college, I majored in computer science while he dabbled in communications and played frat boy CEO with classmates who couldn't organize a group lunch, let alone build a startup. I had a knack for systems efficiency, automation, code that felt like language instead of math. Derek had the charisma, the timing, the vision, as our parents called it. What he didn't have, what he never had, was the discipline to build something from scratch and the patience to get it right. That's where I came in. I remember the first time he asked me to help. I was 29, juggling a full-time job and taking care of my mother-in-law, who was going through chemo. Derek, barely 25, walked into my kitchen wearing a hoodie and a pitch deck printed on glossy paper like it meant something. "I've got this idea," he said, breathless. "Machine learning meets fraud prevention, built for scale." It was nonsense. A bunch of borrowed buzzwords stitched together like a high school essay on innovation. But I listened. Not because it was brilliant, but because I thought, why not help him build something real out of this mess? So I stayed up nights reworking the framework, designing the architecture, writing the first thousands of lines of code while he scheduled lunches with investors and told anyone who'd listen that he was building the future. We filed the incorporation papers together. I paid for the first server costs. I gave the product a name. He wanted to call it something stupid like Fraudcatcher Pro, and I convinced him to go with something cleaner, more versatile. We chose Neuroglance. Short, elegant, memorable. The thing they never tell you about being the quiet one, the helpful one, the person who doesn't need the credit, is that eventually, everyone believes you didn't do anything at all. That was the first trick. The second was when I got pregnant at 36. My marriage was already strained, and when I had a miscarriage early in the second trimester, everything fell apart. I asked Derek for some time off, just a few months. I wanted to come back after I sorted through the grief, the hormones, the lawsuits from my divorce. He said all the right things at first. "Take all the time you need, you'll always have a place here, you're the heart of this company." But while I was driving back and forth between legal meetings and therapy appointments, Derek was sitting down with lawyers. Without even notifying me, he restructured the company as a C Corp, shifted my shares into a silent partner category, and redefined my role as contractual consultant in documents he filed under a shell LLC I'd never even heard of. By the time I returned, our office had moved, my desk didn't exist, and my employee email bounced back with an error message that read, "User not found." I went to our parents. I laid it all out. I even brought the paperwork. My father stared at it for a long time and finally said, "Claire, maybe it's time to let him lead. He's built something amazing here." My mother said, "Why would he push you out if there wasn't a good reason? Maybe he didn't think you wanted to be involved anymore." I had built the damn thing, and suddenly I was being treated like the bitter ex who didn't get the ring. The worst part wasn't that they didn't believe me, it was that they didn't want to believe me. That was the moment I learned. Families don't care about truth, they care about the version of it that lets them sleep at night. After that, I stepped back. I took freelance contracts, lived modestly, stayed off LinkedIn, and watched from a distance as Derek became a darling of the tech world. Magazine covers. Podcasts. 30 Under 30. Visionary of the Year. Every time I heard his voice in a podcast talking about his mission to democratize fraud prevention, I wanted to scream. But I didn't. Not yet. I started documenting. Quietly. Methodically. I collected emails, screenshots, archived web pages from the early versions of the NeuroGlance codebase. I requested copies of old incorporation documents. I spoke to the lawyer who used to handle our startup filings and found out, through a backdoor conversation, that Derek had quietly bought him out with investor money. All of it went into a folder. For years, I told myself it was for closure. But it wasn't. I was waiting for the moment he'd cross the line from unethical to illegal. And last year, he did. He filed a new patent based entirely on the original schema I wrote. But this time, he added false attribution and submitted it under his own name. That was the opening I needed. I reached out to a journalist I trusted, a woman I had worked with years ago during a security breach case. I didn't send her everything. Not yet. But I gave her a taste. I said, "There's more. But I'm not ready to go public until July 4th. Trust me." The call ended with a pause. Then she said, "Are you doing this for justice or for revenge?" I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know, but because I wasn't sure there was still a difference. That night, as I reviewed the press release one more time, I caught my reflection in the darkened laptop screen. I looked older. Not tired, just quieter. More dangerous. The kind of woman who didn't need to raise her voice because the evidence would do it for her. When I hit schedule and saw the words, "Email will be sent at 12:01 a.m., July 5th, something clicked into place. Not relief. Not victory. Something colder. Like I'd just loaded a weapon and placed it gently on the table, waiting for everyone else to realize what it meant. The only question left now was who would still speak to me in the morning. There's something fundamentally grotesque about watching your own fingerprints being used to forge a masterpiece you never signed. Something so profoundly disorienting about hearing your brother on national television describing his proprietary neural model. In perfect corporate jargon, knowing with absolute clarity that the architecture he's explaining in glossy, market-polished words is the exact framework you bled over during sleepless nights while living on instant coffee and stress. Induced ulcers. People think theft is a matter of wallets and locks, but the deepest thefts, the ones that truly devastate, are quieter, cleaner, and infinitely more deniable. They happen in boardrooms with walnut tables and air conditioning, in legal filings buried under layers of corporate restructuring, and in polite conversations filled with compliments that taste like chloroform. It wasn't just that Derek stole the company from under me while I was grieving and vulnerable, or that he rewrote the company history in such a way that I became little more than a ghost in the origin story. It was that he had perfected the performance of humility so well that even the people who should have known better were clapping from the sidelines, admiring the slickness of his public image, never stopping to ask who had set the foundation for him to build it on. In his TEDx talk, yes, the one with the dramatic lighting and the ocean blue button-up and the joke about coding in his garage, he made a throwaway reference to a friend who helped in the early days. Like I was a goddamn barista who once handed him a latte while he scribbled ideas on a napkin. I watched it all unfold with the detached precision of a surgeon preparing for something irreversible. I cataloged everything, every interview, every press piece, every internal memo that made it out into the public via investors or ex-employees too careless to sanitize attachments. He was sloppy in ways only arrogant people are. When you spend long enough being praised, you stop imagining consequences. And Derek, for all his media savvy and startup polish, had begun to believe his own myth. That's what made him vulnerable. The rail break came 3 months before the barbecue, when a junior engineer from his company, someone I didn't know personally, but had once trained at a developer's bootcamp I guest lectured at, reached out to me via LinkedIn. His message was short but pointed. "I think your old schemas in our production environment. I found a module with your signature ID in the backend. Wanna talk?" My hands trembled when I read it. Not because I was surprised, on the contrary. I'd suspected this kind of theft for years, but because finally, someone other than me had seen the truth and had the courage to speak it aloud. We met in a coffee shop downtown, one of those pseudo-industrial places with exposed brick and overpriced croissants, and he showed me on his laptop what I already knew in my bones. There it was, my original schema, my model annotations, even my personal shorthand in the margin comments, all sitting inside Neuroglant's current product deployment, quietly spinning millions in revenue while my name had been surgically removed from every inch of the source tree. That discovery triggered a clause I'd buried in our original partnership agreement, one so obscure even I had nearly forgotten it. Back in the early days, when we were young and hopeful and filing paperwork at the kitchen table, I had insisted on a foundational IP clause that stated, in the event of uncredited reuse of my original technical framework, I retained legal standing as co-author with full rights to claim breach. Derek's lawyers had missed it. He'd missed it. Everyone had, because no one believed I was ever a threat. The moment I realized I had legal teeth again, everything changed. I wasn't just a bitter sister with a folder of emails. I was a co-founder with a legal foothold. I hired a quiet, extremely expensive, highly specialized lawyer, someone who didn't care about my family drama and only asked 2 questions. "Do you have proof? And how loud do you want to be?" I wanted to be very loud. But not yet. The timing had to be perfect. It couldn't be a lawsuit quietly filed on a Monday morning. It had to be a scalpel to the jugular, public, timed, inescapable, with enough precision that it wouldn't just hit Derek's reputation, but also send a shiver down the spine of every investor, partner, and journalist who had blindly ridden his coattails. We planned it like a campaign. The documentation would go first, anonymously leaked to a journalist with credibility. Then the press release, signed by me, backed by legal citation, framed not as a petty revenge narrative, but as a long-overdue correction of the public record. Then the follow-up interviews, selectively offered, never too eager, always appearing calm, articulate, just hurt enough to be human, but firm enough to be credible. We set the date for July 4th because I knew he'd be surrounded by family and friends, drunk on praise, shielded by the illusion that everything in his world was perfect. I wanted the truth to drop like a guillotine in the middle of his applause. The journalist I chose, Marla Bishop from the New York Times tech desk, had a history of torching Silicon Valley egos without flinching. She wasn't sentimental. She was meticulous. When I first called her and laid out the story, she didn't even blink. She asked for documents, timelines, names, version control logs. I gave her everything. She cross-referenced, verified, and when she called me back, her voice was cold with certainty. "He's cooked. This is airtight. Are you ready?" I was more than ready. I had been ready for 10 years. But I didn't tell her that. I just said, schedule it for 12:01 a.m., July 5th. She paused. "You sure?" "Yes. I want him to feel it after the fireworks. When it's quiet. When he's alone with his phone. When everyone else is asleep." She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. And so we waited. Me in silence. Him, on stage, unaware. The image he had spent his life constructing, a clean, noble, visionary man who built something from nothing, was about to be peeled away in one perfect stroke. And beneath it? The truth, raw and sharp and impossible to ignore. Because the thing about clean images is that they only stay clean if nobody ever picks them up to see what's underneath. There's a very specific kind of silence that descends just after a round of fireworks, the kind that carries with it a strange mix of awe, smoke, and emotional hangover, like the crowd doesn't know whether to clap again or just sit with the weight of what they've seen. It's in that silence, thick, expectant, a little stunned, that I wanted the first notification to land, not with drama or shouting or confrontation, but with the quiet brutality of truth slipping through the seams. It was a few minutes before midnight, and the barbecue had evolved into the typical post-fireworks lull, that moment when the kids were either passed out on picnic blankets or sticky with the remnants of popsicles, while the adults hovered around the patio in loose circles, cradling the final drinks of the night and making vague promises about leaving right after this last beer. Derek was in his element, laughing that wide, camera-ready laugh of his, holding court beside the outdoor fire pit like he was still on stage, still being toasted, still the unchallenged monarch of our little family kingdom, and watching him in that moment. Knowing what was about to hit him like a freight train wrapped in legality and cold precision, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and something bordering on mourning, not for him, but for the version of me that had once loved him, believed in him, trusted him enough to share not just a company, but the blueprint of my ambition, my intellect, my creative lifeblood. I stayed near the edge of the patio, nursing a glass of lukewarm rose I hadn't actually tasted in over an hour, watching the glow of citronella candles flicker against the sagging paper lanterns that had survived the evening. The atmosphere now heavy with that finality you only get after a day soaked in sun, beer, and lies. Marissa, ever the attentive hostess, had just finished clearing the dessert table, and my parents were reclined in those plastic Adirondack chairs they'd owned for at least 20 years, smiling the way people do when they've convinced themselves they raised good children. I didn't speak. I didn't hint. I didn't even make eye contact with Derek. I just waited. At 12:01 exactly, my phone buzzed in my pocket with the automatic confirmation. The press release had gone live, the journalist's story was published, and the email list we'd curated with deliberate ruthlessness, including select investors, tech reporters, ex-employees, and a few corporate watchdog groups, had received their copy with every attachment, every document, every time-stamped proof of what had been taken and how long I'd kept silent. There was no rage in that moment, no shaking or heart-pounding vindication. It was surgical. Clean. A quiet exhale after holding my breath for a decade. It took about 6 minutes for the first person to check their phone. It was Marissa, standing just to the right of Derek, phone screen lighting her perfectly contoured face with a blue glow that shifted instantly from idle curiosity to frozen disbelief. I watched as her brows furrowed, her thumb stuttered over the glass, her mouth parted as if to speak, but said nothing. She turned slowly, phone extended, toward Derek. "What is this?" she asked, her voice flat but just loud enough to cut through the ambient murmur. He took the phone, squinted, and I saw his body stiffen like a man-punched not in the stomach, but in the spine, something foundational knocked out of place, something no apology or PR firm could realign. He read it once. Then again. The color drained from his face not in a dramatic movie way, but in that very real, very adult way where someone realizes the structure they've built, meticulously, dishonestly, and with the world's applause, has just cracked at the base, and they cannot, no matter how hard they try, unsee the damage. He looked up from the screen, not at his wife, not at the crowd, but directly at me. Our eyes met across the patio, past the tiki torches and the melting s'mores, and for a second, the noise of the party vanished. He didn't speak. Neither did I. But the understanding passed between us like a live current. I had done this, and he knew exactly why. Finally, he broke the silence with a single phrase, barely audible but sharp enough to cut through the murmur around him. "You did this." I took one slow sip of wine, held his gaze, and responded with a voice that was calm, almost gentle, but impossible to misinterpret. I took out the trash. The reactions around us began to shift rapidly, like a time-lapse of a storm forming, phones buzzing, murmurs spreading, people stepping aside to read their notifications, and then looking at Derek with new eyes, not just confused, but curious, uncertain, maybe even suspicious. My mother sat up straighter, trying to peer at my phone, and my father looked at Derek with the kind of half-frown that meant he didn't yet understand what was happening, but was instinctively bracing himself for it to be inconvenient. Derek stood frozen for a moment longer, holding Marissa's phone like it might physically burn him if he didn't put it down, then turned and walked into the house without a word. I watched his back as he disappeared through the sliding glass door, the man who had once called me his partner in crime, now alone, unsupported, and most delicious of all, unprepared. The next 10 minutes were chaos in slow motion. Marissa followed him, phone in hand, her voice rising just enough for us to hear the edge creep in. One of the investors, someone from Boston, I think, stood up and made a quiet phone call near the fence. My cousin Rachel, who had always treated me like the family oddity, walked over and asked, "Claire, what's going on?" And I simply said, I did what I had to, because there was nothing else worth saying. By 12:30, my phone was lighting up with notifications I didn't check. Interview requests, retweets, messages from ex-colleagues I hadn't heard from in years. All of them suddenly remembering that I had, in fact, been there at the beginning. All of them now curious about the version of the story they'd never been told. I didn't smile. Not because I wasn't satisfied, but because smiling would have cheapened it. At 12:40, Derek re-emerged onto the patio. His shirt was untucked. His hair, usually gelled to perfection, looked damp and unsettled, as if he'd been splashing cold water on his face and still couldn't calm down. He walked straight toward me, and for a brief moment, I thought he might try to defend himself, to plead, to spin, to lie. But all he said was, "Why now?" And I looked him in the eye and gave him the simplest, most honest answer I could, because now, you can't talk your way out of it. He stared at me, jaw tight, fists clenched, but he didn't speak again. He turned and walked back toward the fire pit, where the remnants of his toast still hung in the air like smoke. That was the last time Derek Hastings looked me in the eye. There's a strange stillness that settles over everything the morning after a carefully aimed explosion, not the kind of chaos you might expect in the aftermath of destruction, but a heavy, almost sacred quiet, like the world knows something has fundamentally shifted and is holding its breath to see where all the pieces will land, if they land at all. I woke before the sun had fully broken across the lake, the water still and silvery with the faintest mist skimming the surface, and for a long time I just sat on the edge of the dock with a cup of black coffee growing colder in my hands, watching the reflection of the house ripple slightly with each passing second, each unfolding moment of a day that had already begun writing itself into someone else's headlines. The news had broken exactly as planned. Derek Hastings, founder and CEO of Neuroglance, accused of intellectual property theft, breach of partnership agreement, and willful erasure of a co-founder's contribution, my contribution. The article was clear, well-researched, and thorough, and it didn't sensationalize what didn't need embellishment. It simply told the story, laid it out piece by piece like a trail of breadcrumbs back to a door that Derek had nailed shut 10 years ago, hoping no one would remember who had once lived there. And now, in the harsh, quiet morning, that door had been blown wide open. I knew, even before checking my phone, that the media storm was already building into a full-fledged hurricane. The emails had started flooding in hours before dawn, former colleagues apologizing for their silence, industry contacts congratulating me with a kind of awe that felt vaguely insulting, strangers offering support or telling their own stories of being dismissed, overlooked, written out. It would have been easy, so easy, to lean into the attention, to call in favors, to take interviews and finally tell my side of the story with righteous fury and tearful vindication, but I didn't. I wasn't interested in being seen anymore. I wasn't looking for applause. What I wanted, more than anything, was for the truth to exist on its own, unshouted, undeniable, and sharp enough to wound even in silence. Behind me, I could hear the faint rustling of life beginning to stir in the house. The soft creak of the hallway floorboards, the low murmur of voices rising and falling in fragments too muffled to parse. Someone opened the fridge. A chair scraped against the tile. Someone else, Probably Marissa sighed with the kind of weary exasperation that only comes from trying and failing to hold a crumbling world together with image alone. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. That house, once so solid in its illusion of family unity and effortless success, was no longer a place I belonged, not because they had pushed me out, but because I had finally stopped pretending I ever needed to be let back in. My father came out onto the deck shortly after sunrise, dressed in the same old terrycloth robe he'd worn since I was a teenager, his posture more stooped than I remembered, his eyes a shade dimmer with whatever weight he had yet to name. He stood beside me for a long time, not saying anything, just staring out across the water like it held some kind of answer he didn't want to admit he'd never find. Finally, without looking at me, he said, "You could have told us. You could have come to us first." I didn't move. "I did," I said, my voice low and even, not bitter, not angry, just tired. "You told me not to make trouble. You told me to let it go. You told me to be proud of him." He nodded once, slow and hollow. "You really think you were erased?" I turned toward him then, meeting his eyes not with fire, but with clarity so sharp it left no room for confusion. "I don't think. I know. And so do you. The difference is, I finally decided to stop waiting for you to say it." He didn't respond. Instead, he sat down on the edge of the dock beside me, knees creaking, shoulders sagging, and for a moment he looked more like a man mourning a ghost than a father reconciling with his daughter. The silence stretched out again, comfortable this time, heavy but honest. He didn't apologize. He didn't defend Derek. He didn't try to convince me of anything. Maybe he finally understood that some things can't be undone once you've let them rot for long enough. By late morning, my name was trending not in a flashy celebrity way, but in that viral niche culture fashion where people latch onto a story because it gives shape to something they've felt all along but never had the language for. They called it the silent co-founder reveal, tech's latest reckoning, the sister who didn't stay silent. There were threads, think pieces, LinkedIn essays from people who once worked at Neuroglance claiming they always had a feeling something was off, and others who admitted, shamefully, that they remembered my name but never asked why it had disappeared from the leadership roster. And in the middle of it all, Derek vanished. His social media accounts were locked down by early afternoon. Neuroglance issued a vague statement about internal review and partnership claims currently under legal evaluation. His face disappeared from the homepage. Investors scrambled, employees whispered, and board members convened in emergency meetings. The castle was crumbling, and this time, there was no storm to blame, just the quiet, patient hand of someone who had spent 10 years waiting for the right moment to shake the foundation. By sunset, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer. Something in me resisted the idea of giving this day anything else, any more noise, any more attention, any more power. But I picked up anyway, more out of instinct than curiosity, and when the voice on the other end identified itself as a representative from the Department of Justice's Cyber Division, asking if I would be willing to speak further about my knowledge of potentially fraudulent filings and misrepresented proprietary data within the Neuroglance IPO process, I didn't feel panic or even vindication. I felt calm. I felt ready. Because this wasn't revenge. Not anymore. This wasn't a strike meant to destroy my brother or ruin my family or flip the table just to prove I could. This was the quiet correction of a story that had been wrong for too long, the deliberate reintroduction of a name that should never have been removed, the restoration of a legacy, not the one Derek tried to build on my silence, but the one I buried when I thought loyalty meant disappearing for someone else's comfort. I didn't burn the house down. I just opened the windows and let the truth walk in. And when the truth arrived, dressed not in rage but in proof, it didn't ask for applause. It just asked to be seen.